One of the most important theological words I ever learned, I learned from my mother. I remember I was in junior high. I had just returned from a retreat with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I don't know if you all have ever heard of that organization. It's particularly popular down south, a rather evangelical group of folks, and often like to take the athletes on retreats and have these very emotional-filled weekends. And I remember the word my mom taught me because when I got back, my mom asked me, she says, well, what did you learn? What did y'all talk about? And in my own junior high mind, I summed it up this way. I said, well, I learned we Christians are better than other people. And my mom said, hogwash. Actually, she said something else, but I can't repeat it on Sunday morning. So we'll say what she said was hogwash. And over the years, I've come to appreciate that that's one of the most important theological words I can use when I hear certain things said about what it means to follow Christ by certain segments of society and church, that sometimes it's important to say hogwash. One of those theological ideas that I often find myself shaking my head at and saying this is hogwash is something called the prosperity gospel. You all ever heard of the prosperity gospel? Interesting idea in this theological perspective is that God rewards the faithful with material wealth and health, the health and wealth gospel. That if you're faithful, God will reward you with a big checking account. That God, if you're faithful, that you will be given great health and great wealth. It's a very popular theological idea in the 21st century. Kind of, in many ways, we have to admit there are elements, particularly in the Hebrew Scriptures, that kind of resonate with that. It kind of flows a little bit out of Norman Vincent Peale's idea of being positive all the time, and that will give you good things. It kind of reminds me of Janis Joplin's song, "Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz?" But it's interesting these days, has found a kind of fullness of expression, a popular expression, through the preaching and writing of a pastor named Joel Osteen. He's written a number of books. I wrote some of them down. I can't remember them off the top of my head. Let me see. The Power of Who I Am. You Can, You Will, and Your Best Life Now. These are bestsellers. It's raised millions of dollars for himself and for the church. Now, the health and wealth gospel is really kind of articulates a vision of the world and a vision of society that honors certain people and shames others. In other words, if you're poor because you're not faithful enough. If you're ill because you're not faithful enough. And over as I read the Scriptures, as I reflect on that, the word that comes to mind is the one that my mom said so many years ago, hogwash, right? And what I struggle with is how this theological idea could have come from the same Bible that we read every Sunday. In particular, the passage we read today. Sermon on the Mount. Some would say that's a summation of Jesus' message about what's important in the world. And what we have to understand is that in Jesus' world, in the first century, honor and shame were very important elements of one's place in society. Who is to be honored and who is to be shamed. Now, what's interesting is that we see very much so in Jesus' society, and the one in which he was speaking out against, this kind of health and wealth gospel. The society in which Jesus preached, the culture, if you were poor, it was because God didn't like you, right? If you had an illness, leprosy, a disease, it was because you weren't faithful enough. And so those are the people to be shamed, to be excluded, to be sent out. And who's to be honored? Oh, the faithful ones, the temple priests, the people who have lots of wealth. They're the ones to be honored, right? And that's exactly the world, that first century, that Jesus speaks to. And he turns it all upside down. Blessed are not the joyful, but the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are not the joyful, those dancing around, but those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, not the proud, the powerful, but the meek, for they are the ones who will inherit the earth. It sounds as ridiculous to us today as it did to them in the first century. How can that be? How can it be that the poor in spirit, that those who mourn, those who are persecuted, who are reviled, how can it be that they're the ones who God honors, while in our world they're the ones we shame, isn't it? Think about it today. In our society, in our culture, this very cynical culture, who is it we honor? And who is it we shame? If you're poor, it's a moral problem, right? Because you didn't work hard enough. It's a moral failing to be poor these days. It's a moral failing in many ways to be shamed, in part because you need some help. God, we don't need a world where there's a society of people who need help. Even in our world today, we honor those, the health and wealthy, and shame those who are not in that way. Subtle ways, maybe more than in Jesus' time, but it's still there. Years ago, I was the associate pastor at a church in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and we'd invited a speaker to come to our church. He was a man who had been homeless, and he had, through luck and through the help of others and through his own hard work, he had been able to kind of find his way out of that, and had been able to find a job and be able to find a home. And he wrote this book about his experience of being homeless. So we had asked him to come and talk about, share that experience, what it felt like to be homeless, and his journey to hopefully redemption is maybe even the language we might have used. A place of honor in society, so to speak. This might even been the way we think about it. And what was most interesting, what he shared with us, is that for homeless people, what they feel the most is ashamed. So ashamed they didn't want anybody to know them. And that part of his journey was to let go of that shame. Which is sad, because in the world that Jesus sees, that we're called to follow, those are the people we're supposed to honor. There's no avoiding it. Those are the people we're supposed to be honoring. and not shaming. Struck me the past day or so, it's not about politics, it's about refugees. And if ever there was a group of people who could be described in the Sermon on the Mount, it would be refugees. Can you imagine the poverty of spirit it would take to leave behind everything you have, to go to another country? Can you imagine that poverty of spirit? Can you imagine what they're mourning? The loss of everything they had, the loss of family. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine having such no power to even be reviled by the country you're coming to? Can you imagine that? And the challenge for us as a church is those are the people we're supposed to honor. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.